And today we are talking about how to start a podcast. Podcasting is a great way to reach a new audience, and if you haven't started a podcast yet, it's a great way to do it now because a new year can equal a new project. And I always wanted to launch my own podcast, so I decided to grab my microphone and just get started. And I know how overwhelming it can be to think about launching your own podcast. You might have listened to other podcasts and they all sound very polished, very professional, and they deliver tons of value. But don't worry, I'm here to help, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can get started and really how easy and cost efficient it is to get started with a podcast. The number one thing when you get started is to choose a topic. So first thing that you want to do, choose a topic that your podcast is all about. And you want to choose a topic that you are super passionate about. You want to choose a topic that you can talk about for hours. And this could be your favorite movie, you could become a movie critic, maybe you love watching movies, and then you talk about those movies in your podcast and talk to your audience about your own thoughts, about what you think about the movie. Or you can start a food podcast where you try restaurants in your city, and then you can rate them, you can tell your audience what you tried and what they should try. There are tons of opportunities and ways that you can start a podcast. Just choose a topic that you're super passionate about. And the next thing is equipment. And I know that a lot of people always get caught up in what type of equipment should I get. And next thing you know, they're Googling best equipment for a podcast or best microphone for a podcast. And guess what? Most of the people suggest a microphone that's like $300. But trust me, you don't need to get a microphone that costs you $200, $300, or $400. You can get started with a microphone that is seriously $60 from Amazon. It doesn't even need to be a brand. My microphone that I'm using for all my videos, I think I purchased it off Amazon for, $65, $70. It's not a brand, but the audio quality is good. So don't overthink the microphone. And if you decide to do a podcast, I always recommend getting a pop screen. You can get a pop screen for $10 already, also on Amazon. And a pop screen is basically a round circle with a little bit of foam that you put right in front of your microphone. So when you say words like P, like podcast, it will filter out the harsh sound and it will make it sound nicer. So I definitely recommend a pop stand that you can put in front of your microphone. And of course, if you record, you have a microphone, you have the little pop stand, you also need a computer that you can edit your work. And you can get really any computer. Most of us probably have a laptop, most of us probably have a Mac computer. And if you are a Mac user, you can use GarageBand. So no need to buy any fancy tool for podcast editing. Trust me, GarageBand is doing the work just fine. You can edit your tracks, you can enhance the voices there. So just read into GarageBand, it's free, and you are ready to go with your podcast. And going back to all those Google searches and microphone searches, don't get hung up on some simple searches and equipment that other people tell you that you need, because you don't. I always say, if this is your first time launching a podcast, just get started. If your podcast is taking off and you need to invest in more expensive equipment, you can always do it down the line. But at the beginning, just keep it simple. Just get started and see if you even want to continue podcasting. A lot of us think, I want to become a podcaster, and you are putting out 4, 5, 6 episodes, and then you realize, damn, that's a lot of work. So I don't really want to do it anymore. But now I bought this $300 microphone, so I kind of need to do it. So don't be that person. Just get started with something simple that you can afford and see if podcasting is something for you, and see if that is even a channel that makes sense for your business. And also, by the way, mostly no one, unless you are really into sounds and microphones, people cannot even tell the difference between a $60 microphone and a $200 microphone. So you're good with your $60 microphone. Next, now that you come up with a topic, you decided on your equipment, you want to think about whether this is going to be a solo podcast or you're going to have a co-host. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. And let me break them down for you. You can either start the podcast on your own or you can have a co-host. I decided to do a solo podcast, so it's just me talking to you. And the advantage of doing that, it's easy because it's just me. I don't need to run down ideas with my co-host. So it's only one person that needs to agree with the ideas, and that's me in this case. I don't need to plan anything. I don't need to plan out a time slot works for me and my co-host to produce a podcast. I can just get started anywhere, anytime, with any topic that I feel like talking about. It's also much easier to edit because only one person is talking. But the downside on hosting a podcast on your own is because it's a solo podcast, you only have one voice talking the entire time. And that can get a little bit boring for the listener because you only hear one voice. And because you're only listening to one voice, it can be hard to keep the listener's attention. And those birds outside, I'm not sure if you guys hear them, but they're going crazy. So let's just ignore those birds. But it can also be challenging to keep up the energy. If you have someone else, you can bounce off one in each other for the energy. But if it's just you, sometimes it's hard to keep the energy at 100 the entire episode. And now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a co-host? One of the advantages is definitely that you have two people in a podcast, so it's a little bit more dynamic and you can bounce off one in each other. Also, if you have more people, everyone has their own opinion, so your whole show can become more dynamic, it's a little bit more creative, and it's more entertaining to listen to that. But as I mentioned before, the drawback of having a co-host, first of all, you really have to plan. You have to see when someone is available. And if you talk about a certain topic, and especially if you're two people and you have a flowing conversation, those conversations can go to no man's land real quick. So you can go off topic in no time. The editing process will also take you a little bit more time because you have two voices, or even more depending on if you invite a guest. And I think the biggest drawback for me, if you start a podcast with a co-host, if at one point in time you decide to part ways. So let's say you have a podcast together and then one of the members decide, I don't want to do this podcast anymore. Then you have to decide, do you want to continue the podcast on your own, or is this the end of the podcast? And that's really one of the biggest drawbacks for me, because you always have to rely on another person and it's not as easy as just replacing that person. And next up in the process, name your podcast. Now that's the fun and creative part. Your podcast name is the first thing that people will see when they come across your show. It definitely has to be memorable and unique. And when it comes to naming your podcast, be very careful with the names. You don't want to use any puns or acronyms. Especially acronyms can have a different meaning, maybe in other languages, or maybe other people use those acronyms in a different way. And the last thing you want to do is offend someone with your podcast name. So keep it simple, unique, and straight to the point. So for example, you can use your name or your topic as a podcast. I, for example, named my podcast Content Marketing Cheat Sheet. And so everyone knows that this podcast is all about content marketing, and the word cheat sheet implies that I uncover tips and tricks that you might not know, but they will definitely help you to advance in content marketing. Once you found a name and you say, hey, this is the name I want to use for my podcast, do your research and make sure this name is not taken by any other podcaster or this name is trademarked in any other way. Also, stay away from names that are very similar to other people's podcasts, because a listener might not know the exact spelling, so they just type it in, let's say, to Apple Podcast or Spotify, and they really wanted to listen to your podcast, but since your name is so similar to someone else, they end up at someone else's podcast and not your podcast. So make sure your listeners don't end up at someone else's podcast by accident. Now that you chose your topic, you choose your equipment, you decide whether you want to go solo or having a co-host, you found a name, now you want to create your channel art. Channel art is the little cover page that you see when you pull up your podcast on Apple, Google, or Spotify. And your channel art, or the little thumbnail icon, should relate to what you're talking about in your podcast. So you don't want to use something that is totally off and does not really make sense. And if you ask yourself, how do I create this channel art? It's super simple. Go to Canva, whether you have a paid account, you have a free account, use Canva to create your podcast icon. Canva, as you know, they also offer templates, so you can, if you're not the most creative person, just look at the templates that Canva offers, choose one, and then make it your own. I also want to encourage you to create some sort of pre-written blurb that you can put into each and every podcast episode, including links to your website, links to your social media channels, and what your podcast is all about. So depending on the podcast, you have a pre-written blurb that you can just customize for each episode and then upload that with your podcast. You need to record in a quiet space that doesn't have an echo. And of course, not everyone has a super professional space where there's no outside noises. Even if you listen to my podcast and watch my videos, you might hear an airplane, you might hear the dogs barking from our neighbors, or someone is cutting a tree, or even those birds. Well, do you know what? It is what it is. As long as it's not too overpowering, you can definitely get away with those little background noises. But when you're creating your podcast, definitely make sure that there's no loud and noisy appliances right next to you. So make sure that the TV is not on, or someone is using a blender or slamming pots or whatnot, but something that's super loud and distracting. So make sure there's no noisy stuff around you. So ideally, find an empty room that you can use. Maybe you're lucky and have a garage, so you can go into your garage to record your podcast. And when you found a space, you want to make sure that your recording space has some sort of furniture. So whether it's a carpet or it's curtains or a couch, but something that's made out of fabric. And the reason why, so when you talk, your sound waves are traveling. And your curtains or your carpet or your couch, they're absorbing the sound waves, so it sounds better. So you can do the trick. You can go into your restroom and talk, or you can go into your living room and talk, and you hear the difference. Optionally, if you have a room that's to your disposal, you can buy those foam panels. You find them on Amazon as well, and you can just stick them to your wall, and they're going to absorb the sound as well. But again, this is only if you have some sort of free space where you can stick them on the wall, because trust me, you don't want to stick them on into your living room walls because they're dead ugly. Editing softwares, you can use GarageBand. I mentioned it before. In case you are a Mac user, this is totally free. It's super simple to use. And if you're not a Mac user or you don't want to use GarageBand, I can also recommend the Script. The Script also helps you to edit your podcast. And that's an online tool you can sign up whether you're a Mac user or you're a Windows user. And every podcast has a jingle and an intro at the beginning. So you can create that intro and the jingle yourself, or you can find someone on Fiverr who can do it for you for, I don't know, $100. I actually created my jingle all by myself with the help of my husband. So he's actually the voice that you hear at the beginning of my podcast. And then I found music that is royalty free that you can use for your business. You can also pay for soundtracks, but definitely make sure you can use it for your business. So you want to get into any trouble. And then use that soundbite and put it under your intro. The intro doesn't need to be long, can be anywhere from like 10, 15, 20 seconds long, where you just simply describe what your podcast is all about. And what I like to do, it's a little pro tip. I like to save the beginning and the ending of my podcast as individual soundtracks. So you don't have to say the intro every time you're recording a podcast, but instead save them on individual files onto your computer. Once you edit the podcast, you can just insert the beginning and the end to your podcast, and it will save you tons of time. Because when it comes to podcasts, when it comes to your audio, a podcast, you want to make sure you keep the same beginning every time. You want to keep the same jingle, you want to keep the same intro, because that creates brand recognition and it helps you to be more cohesive across your podcast episodes. And now, let's say you recorded your podcast, now it's time to host your podcast. And hosting is what makes your podcast available on Spotify, Google, or Apple Podcast. Hosting can be free or paid. There's so many options out there. But if you're choosing a free service, there will be a certain time where your service is not free anymore. So meaning once you used up all the storage, because obviously your podcast needs to store it somewhere. So at a certain amount, after you have, 20 episodes, that storage might be free and you have to opt in for a paid version. But generally speaking, paid options right off the gate, they have unlimited storage and bandwidth available for you. You just have to compare different vendors. I found a place called anchor.fm, which you can check out. You can host your podcast on there. Once you host your podcast on that channel, we'll make it automatically available to Spotify and Google. And Apple Podcast just needs a little bit of additional setup. But if you have a website, such as like Squarespace, for example, you can also host your podcast on your Squarespace website and then make it available on like Spotify and Google Podcast and Apple Podcast. Now that you chose a topic, you decided on a co-host or a solo show, you found your name, you created your channel art, you have all your equipment in place, you created your hosting platform, you recorded your first episode. Now it's time to promote the whole thing. And the best time to publish a podcast, it's typically on Tuesday and Thursday at 5 a.m. And yes, you heard that right, 5 a.m. in the morning. So the majority of people listen to podcasts when they're commuting to work or when they're getting ready in the morning. And that's typically around the 5, 6, or 7 a.m. time frame. So you want to make sure you publish your podcast early to grab all the people who are commuting. And obviously, to make things easier, you don't have to wake up at 5 a.m. every day to publish your podcast. No, you would just schedule it in advance. And now you also want to promote your show. You can promote your show across your social media platforms. You can tell family and friends to listen to your show, and then hopefully that they recommend your show to other people, so word of mouth. But the easiest way really to get started is just push out content to your other social media channels, telling everyone that you just launched a podcast and they should all listen to it. And I have another pro tip for you. You can also upload your podcast to YouTube. So there's two ways. Some people film themselves while they do the podcast, so you already have a movie file, or some people just do an audio only. But regardless what you do, you can put it into an easy movie program, such as like iMovie, again, if you're a Mac user, chop it up and upload it to YouTube. So you can export your audio file, even if you're just recording audio and you don't want to film yourself, you can get the audio file, upload it to your movie program, whether it's like iMovie, put in your channel art. And now the entire time someone would watch a YouTube video, all they see is your channel art, but your podcast is available on YouTube. If you upload it to YouTube, it will give you additional exposure and will also help you with search engine optimization. And honestly, it can never hurt to upload your podcast also to YouTube. To sum it up, podcasting is a great way to reach a new audience or to connect with your audience on a deeper level. It's a great new project that you can start right now in 2023. So I gave you all the fundamentals to get started. It's really much easier than you initially thought it would be. Also, audio is a great way to connect with people because you can listen to it anywhere and everywhere. I mean, people can listen to your podcast when they're driving to work, when they're flying anywhere from vacation, or if they're just relaxing at home, or even if they're washing the dishes. So a podcast is a great way to enhance your customer experience. And keep in mind, if you want to succeed, you don't need to buy fancy equipment, just keep it simple and just get started. And if you need help getting started, or you're not really sure on what equipment should I really buy that's affordable, reach out to me. You can hit me up on social media at The Social Wisdom, or you can send me an email at nina@thesocialwisdom, and we can connect that way. And that led us yet again to another episode of the Content Marketing Cheat Sheet podcast. I'm so glad you tuned in today, and I cannot wait to see you next week. Until then, goodbye, or how we say in Germany, auf Wiedersehen.